this evening. Could you please do roll call?
Sade Colwood. Oh, first, sorry. Remember that when you say your name, you have to say your name and then say attending virtually from wherever you're coming from. Sorry about that. Sade Colwood. You're muted, hon.
Present. I'm virtually attending from Douglas, Massachusetts.
Thanks. Noel Garcia Jr.
Present. I'm virtually attending from East Lansing, Michigan.
Chuck Grigsby.
East Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County, present. Chuck Grigsby.
Cedric Haro.
Present, attending virtually from Mason, Michigan, Ingham County.
Helen Josephson.
Virtually attending from East Lansing, Ingham County, Michigan.
Sharon Reed Davis. Chris Root.
Present. I'm attending virtually from East Lansing and Ingham County.
Quentin Tyler.
Present, attending from Lexington, Kentucky.
Ooh. Eric Williams.
Oh, I'm here in East Lansing.
Tanya Williams.
Present, virtually attending from DeWitt, Clinton County.
Ron Bacon. He was here. Okay. Kelly Ellsworth Etchison has let us know that she's unable to attend. So that's everyone.
Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that. If someone does pop in and I don't actually see them, can you let us know, and so we can recognize them, get them officially on the roll call. All right, so let's move to item 1.2, approval agenda, 11/23/20. Before we go into that, I just would like to possibly make an amendment to the agenda today to add an item 3.2 regards to discussion of the December and future meetings. We kind of left that open-ended, and I should have had that on the agenda for us this evening. I was wondering if anyone would want to entertain that motion.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, moved by Commissioner Williams, seconded by Commissioner Root. Is there any discussion on adding that amendment? Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. So moved. So we'll add that to item 3.2, future meeting going forward. I just got a couple of different things before we hit to the next item, just a couple of housekeeping things. When you want to make a motion or before you speak, please identify yourself and raise your hand on the motions. That would be very helpful for me as far as being able to recognize you appropriately. It seemed like I was calling the same people every single time on the previous meeting, so I want to kind of get that cleaned up. And then also, tonight's agenda is really action-packed, as you probably all have seen. So I just want to get you guys to understand there probably will be a lot of questions. With the length of time that we have and that is appropriate, we might not get to every single question you may have, but we will maybe come up with something in a way that we can still get those questions asked and addressed and have them going forward in our next meeting. So please don't get apprehensive about that, and please ask as many questions you want, but I just kind of want to get that in the back of your head in regards to this meeting, because we do have a lot of content with what we're going to be doing tonight. All right, so moving on to item 1.3, approval of the minutes of November 9th, 2020. I'll entertain a motion if there's no amendments or changes to those minutes.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner Williams. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Josephson that I saw. She raised her hand as I've asked nicely to do, so I can see you. Appreciate that. Is there any discussion on that? Seeing none, all those in favor of approval of November 9th, 2020 of the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, motion passes.
Chuck,
Thank
it
you.
looks like Ron is back on if you want to acknowledge him.
Thank you. Councilmember Bacon, could you please identify where you're calling from remotely, please? Acknowledge your presence.
Yep, present. East Lansing, Michigan, Clinton County.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon, for that. All right, we are now to item 1.4, written communications. We have quite a bit underneath there, so I'll just start with the line items. Everyone's got a chance to see the written communication. Starting with the NACO agency profiles, is there any comments, questions, feedback to those particular written comments that were submitted to us? Yes, please, Commissioner Williams.
I'd like to say that once I started reading those profiles, I noticed they were substantially out of date. So there's, if you want to rely on them, you better do some checking because they're like 6-7 years old.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. And as we do know, with some of these oversight commissions that we've been researching, things do change quite a bit once they are up and running, as far as them really being functional. I just, from that, I looked at, most of them, and I recognized it looks like Eugene, Oregon's information. And, there were some things in there that I thought, were comparable to maybe something that will incorporate similarities. Don't get me wrong, these are similarities to maybe some of the things will be incorporated with our report overall. So outside of that, the other ones seem like they weren't very specific to some of the things that we would be concerned about. All right, moving on. Goals for establishment of Police Oversight Commission, HORO, written communication. You have any comments or reactions to that, Commissioner Ho? You want to say anything to those goals that you submitted?
No, they're pretty self-explanatory. I would entertain any comments, but nothing to add.
I just would like to ask you a quick question. And if you don't have an answer or whatnot, I was just curious. When you go down to specific recommendation for goals of the oversight body, when you talk about investigate individual complaints of alleged police misconduct, maybe parallel to the internal investigation.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question. Were you thinking that when you talk about parallel investigation, was that at the same time or after the internal investigation is completed, or did you get that far in your thought process?
To be honest, I haven't thought about whether that would be concurrent or subsequent. I know there are some procedures in which, particularly for appellate bodies, where if the complainant feels unsatisfied with the internal affairs investigation, they would ask for the civilian oversight body to review that investigation. So that's certainly a possibility, but I hadn't really had either way in mind.
Understood. The reason why I ask is because a lot of, and I think including ours, that there is no release of any information at all until that internal investigation is completed and there's been a determination. And that obviously sometimes is a challenge when it comes to some of the community members seeking questions. And then my final question to that point is, when you're talking about doing an investigation, were you thinking that that investigation process should include case reports, police reports, and video footage within that?
Certainly anything which is legally permissible to give to the civilian oversight body. I think we'll probably get into it a little bit later today, but there are increasing calls for full subpoena power for civilian oversight bodies. So I think that's definitely a possibility.
Thank you. That's all I had. We'll move on if anyone didn't have any else to that. Thank you for submitting that. I appreciate that. It's going to be some good stuff we'll definitely be probably using down the road along with the other commissioners who have submitted their information. All right, goals for establishment of police oversight, use of force incidents weekly arrest report. This was submitted and it was very enlightening for me to be able to see, a period of time, substantial period of time of kind of how some things there. Did anyone have any reactions or comments in regards to the use of force incidents weekly arrest reports that was submitted? Yes, Commissioner Harrell.
I just had a few questions. So first, in the use of force code column, I was curious as to why there would be an NA, a not applicable, for the use of force code, and yet still have this incident included in the use of force report. Whether that was, a misclassification or something along those lines. And similar to that, I was wondering if either Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson could speak to, for example, the incident on July 14th, where there was no charged offense, but a firearm was displayed. So I understand there are any numerous reasons why that might occur. If they could just sort of give some idea of what some of those reasons were.
Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson, you care to respond?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the NA just because this document wasn't compiled by us, so I don't know why that was noted as NA in that force code column. However, to speak to the firearm display, but there may not be a charge associated with that. Anytime an officer displays their firearm, unholsters their firearm, or takes a long gun out of the vehicle, out of their patrol vehicle, they're required to complete a use of force report. So, there's any number of scenarios where an arrest may not be made. Just to give you two kind of offhand scenarios, one may be where an officer is doing a building search. Let's say we go on an alarm and find a potentially broken into building and they clear the building. They're going to have their firearms out during that procedure. So if they don't find anybody, there may not be an arrest. There won't be an arrest code associated with that. Also, I can speak to, let's say, and this is a real incident that occurred just recently. We were requested as mutual aid into another agency's jurisdiction. There was a weapons complaint. Our officers had their weapons out while they responded to that situation, but the other jurisdiction actually handled the enforcement of the criminal violation. And so that's why you may see weapons displays without arrest charges associated.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. Commissioner Root.
I can speak to those 3 cases where it says NA in the use of force code. There's a little note right at the top. This was compiled by East Lansing Info, and I asked them if I could share it with the study committee, so I'm pretty familiar with it. The reason it says NA is that this was an incident that did not have a use of force code in the weekly report. It was the incident at the 7-Eleven where there was a special, investigation. There was a presentation made to council. It was discussed as a use of force incident. It was in the case report that it was use of force. And I don't know why it wasn't in the weekly arrest report, which was the source for this spreadsheet. So I was the person, or actually I wasn't, but Eli put in that NA. And that happens to be, there's a note at the top, and that's the only case where something was added where there wasn't use of force recorded in the weekly report because it became evident from other information.
Thank you, Commissioner Root, for that insight. Yes, Commissioner Haro and I believe Vice Chair Williams raised their hand.
I was just wondering if we could hear from the department why, given that obviously became such a high-profile incident, why there was no initial use of force code in that report.
Yeah, that's something that I'll get into in my presentation, but it speaks to what everybody's been talking about over the past several weeks of having an early warning system or a use of force tracking system in place. The reporting system that we have right now, the SRMS system run by the state, when we generate reports, it pulls data from different sections of the system. So when an officer submits a police report, let's say tonight I go out and I make a disorderly conduct arrest and I have to use pepper spray during the arrest. In my police report, if I don't put that force code or that file class, that 4-digit code into the system, when I run that case and arrest, that weekly case and arrest summary, it's not going to pull it. But yet, if I still document my use of force, when I run a use of force report on my end through our dashboard, it's going to pull that out. So in the interim, what we've discussed is to run weekly audits to make sure that officers are including that 4-digit code. It's supposed to be caught at the initial supervisor level when they review it, but that doesn't always happen, obviously. So on our end, we're running weekly audits to make sure that things are being coded correctly. It's not a situation where the force is not being documented. It's a situation where it's just not being coded correctly. So hopefully that makes sense. But if not, please let me know.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. I know this is not your document, and you may probably address this a little bit later on, but is the other force classification where you're just doing the handcuffing, where you're just trying to get things understood, or does that mean a multiple of different things when you say other force?
Yeah, other force could be non-arrest handcuffing if someone is detained but not placed under arrest and eventually released. And it could also be physical controls. So if someone has to use a pressure point, or if someone has to use a technique called a wrist lock, that could be captured as other force as well.
And the wrist lock and all that, the pressure point, that's different from the PPCT, or that's kind of the same classification?
It's in the same vein. So what we're working with, and I mean, I think we all know this, we have an imperfect system. And hopefully we can get to a system where, and I'll speak to it again during my presentation, where we have a system that is a lot more detailed and a lot more, when it comes to use of force, a lot more dedicated to tracking, to be able to pull the right data that we need and, you know, share with the community.
Yes, thank you. And just my last thing on this. So in this particular document, and I haven't seen your official one, how it's classified, but it seems like there's only most of the time just one use of force identified, and very rarely, you know, more than one where you do a couple different things. Is there a particular reason for that, or is it just the circumstance of what we're looking at here, or how did that work with you guys submitting specific details? Is that part of what you want to improve upon as far as the stuff you talked about earlier?
That's one thing that we need to improve upon, one thing that we need to capture in our audits. But I also want to make a clear point that, so if I, in that disorderly arrest, I use a wrist lock and I use pepper spray, okay? Those should be two file classes that go into the police report. But also when I do my report, I have to know that I used that physical control and I used that PCA in the actual police report. So when I pull the data out on a use of force report, that should show up. When I pull, if I don't code it correctly, it's not going to show up correctly. So, you know, again, we're kind of going back around in a circle here. It really does come down to having a good dedicated system to capture this information and capture it correctly. But also we have a human element here too, that, you know, garbage in, garbage out, we've got to make sure that we are inputting data properly. And we also have to make sure that we are auditing it or reviewing it properly as it makes its way through the system.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. And I really appreciate the acknowledgement of just kind of, you know, we're not perfect, you know, and you know, and we all can improve in everything. So I appreciate that comment. Anything else from anyone else in regards to the use of force weekly arrest reports that was submitted in written communication? All right, thank you. Let's move on to, we have goals to achieve by Commissioner Root that was submitted. Thank you, Commissioner Root. Did anyone have any reactions, comments, or anything you wanted to highlight, Commissioner Root, in regards to your goals? I have one little thing to ask you about. On item 7, you indicated the Oversight Commission should consistently and in a timely manner receive information from ELPD that is legally allowed to obtain. Are you familiar with where I'm talking about, Commissioner Root?
I'm looking.
My question is, did you have an idea or thought process about what you thought would be timely in regards to that? submission. Any thoughts on that at all?
I don't know the best answer. What I'm getting at here is I think it would be incredibly valuable if a certain type of data and a certain time frame could be decided on and could be counted on. Because there's been a lot of stress and conflict and loss of time debating those issues sometimes in this community and other communities. And I know, for example, in Chicago recently, for particularly serious incidents after the Laquan McDonald shooting, there was a decision made that within 60 days, 8 things would be provided. Wasn't about all complaints, it was about a particular group. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my goodness, that would be really helpful. So that's where that idea came from, in addition to experience, that if we didn't have to negotiate each time and wonder each time and think about what to ask for each time and wonder what will happen if we ask for it each time, relationships would be better, the process would be better. That's what's on my mind.
Thank you, Commissioner Root. And when you think it's appropriate, do you mind sharing those recommendations of the 8 things?
From Chicago? Sure.
Yeah, just for us to kind of get a perspective on what
Yeah.
types of 8 things those are.
Happy to do that.
Really appreciate that. Any other comments, reactions to written communication by Commissioner Root? All right, moving to item 1.5, pursuant to MCL 15263, subsection 1, limiting public comment to 5 minutes per individual participation today. I'll entertain a motion to enforce that item 1.5 in today's meeting. So with no reaction, I'm assuming that for item 1.5, no one has a problem with a time limit today on public comment. Is that what
I'll
I'm
move
understanding?
it for discussion. If we don't move it, we have no time limit.
Correct.
Probably is not what we're intending given our practice.
So moved by Commissioner Root. Is there a second?
Support.
Seconded by Vice Chair Williamson in regards to that. And that's exactly what we did last week. We had a long pause until someone stepped up with that. So in regards to this item here, all those who are in favor of that item to limiting the public comment to 5 minutes, if there's no more discussion on that or amendments, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So move. So item 1.5 will have public comment limiting to it for 5 minutes, not our usual 3. And please, if we do have any callers, don't forget to remind them of the 30-second mark so they have an idea of where they're at with their comments. Do we have anyone on the line for communication from audience for item 2, Justin?
Thank you, Chuck. We do not have any callers in the queue for public comment at this time.
All right. All right, moving on to item number 3, new business 3.1, draft outline study committee reports to city council, subgroup 2 memo draft report outline 1120 that was submitted. Would anyone from that group like to talk about this document under new business?
Yeah. I agreed to give a little summary, and Sade is going to fill in with comments, and Noel is welcome to do so too. This is the group that Sade originally suggested, thinking that it would be very beneficial if we early on think about the sections of the report. And that one thing that would allow us to do is not leave all of the report to the very end to write, that it would enable us to write some sections earlier on. So we just set ourselves the task, and we met on Friday, of coming up with an outline. that would be a, you know, a draft, so that we could have some kind of idea of what we thought we would want to produce in response to the council's request of us to make them a report with our recommendations. So we thought of a pretty simple structure. Section 1 would be brief on the purpose, just so you've got everything in that one place with the resolution and the history of the study committee itself. Section 2 would be background about what has happened in East Lansing and what is happening now that is relevant to oversight. And some more detail of that might be in an appendix, but we thought it was important to have some in the body of the report before people get to the recommendations. Number 3 is national and national context about other cities' oversight commissions, and also legal and union context in Michigan and, you know, with the police unions here in East Lansing. And then number 4 is the meat and potatoes of actual recommendation. And there's lots of different sections, and that came from looking at the NACOL guidebook as a beginning, and then just going through ordinances from a couple of cities, looking at what's, you know, how they're structured, what sections they have. So, and then some appendices and references. So that what seemed to us was that sections 1, 2, and 3 probably don't need to wait until the end. Section 4 certainly does, because you can't write section, you know, it's very important not to deliberate to a decision outside the full study committee. So the study committee would need to make its decisions about the recommendations for an oversight commission that would be explained in section 4. So section 4 would be written right at the end, but that some of the other 3 sections, we're not ready to write all of them now, but they could be written earlier. And it did seem to us that section 1 about the purpose of the study committee could, for the most part, be written, you know, could at least get started soon. So we wanted to bring this to you for your consideration, and thought that if we could agree that this is a general outline, not that, you know, we can't make changes as we go, but if this was a general outline, and that maybe we could agree specifically to section 1 and ask somebody to do the draft, then we could sort of model how we think we can move forward with this report. Sade or Noel, do you have any comments?
I think we also discussed that the entire group needed to make a group decision on this outline as a final report. And then we had some discussion as to, is our final report going to look like a city ordinance proposal, policy proposal? Well, the 3 of us met and we felt this is the best way to handle the reporting, but we don't want to go any further unless we have a group consensus. I shouldn't say we don't want to go any further. I think we owe it to everybody that we have a group consensus on how we move forward with this report.
Understood. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, so I'll just echo what's already been said. I think the other thing is, initially when I looked at the first kind of iteration of the draft, I was like, oh, this is a lot. But one of the things that we were also thinking about is, one, leaving little to no room for questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the decisions that we're making, by providing rationale, by providing legitimate and concrete examples, so that if there are questions that arise, we have some case studies that can be referred to. So only further support what we're doing here. The other thing that came up was for the Police Oversight Committee to be able to use some of this report as their foundation. So we are already taking 6 months to kind of get this started. So imagine throwing a whole new group together, and they're going to also also need time to get started. So this is a one kind of way to build a foundation for them. So with information and resources that they can also rely on, these are things that also they can, feel free to modify and change as they see fit. But this will also help them in the work that they will ultimately be doing. As we can already see, like 6 months for them to start and actually see change, it's going to take a while. So we thought that the more information that we can have, the better it will be going forward. So that's what you see that we presented here today.
Thank you, commissioners, for that explanation. Does any commissioners have any upfront questions in regards to what they see in regards to what they have offered in their presentation? I just had one question, maybe two. Can you, I'm looking at section 2, history and current practices of oversight of police in East Lansing. And I'm not familiar with ordinance 1463, establishing a public safety review board. It sounds very familiar for some reason. I can't wrap my head around it. Does anyone know or can speak to that by chance? Yes, Commissioner Root.
The history of reports to the Human Relations Commission is kind of intertwined with this ordinance 1463 because there had been discussion over years in the HRC about how can it be more effective, what the annual reports from ELPD, and also an awareness that the HRC had no authority to do anything with the information they received. And so over time, the idea came up that wouldn't it be better to have a structure created that actually had a role in relationship to complaints. So some work was done to draft what became Ordinance 1463. It's a very brief ordinance. I'll attach it to written comments for our next meeting, so it becomes something that everybody will have access to. It's only a complaint review board. And when that was brought forward to council, the HRC was asked to give a look at it and give comments to council. And actually that's where this study committee came from because there was a number of people came to the HRC and said, people in the community weren't involved in drafting this, and it has a number of weaknesses, and it would be better to try to start over again to write an ordinance. And lo and behold, we are now trying to work toward drafting a new ordinance. So I'll attach that to the written comments.
Thank you. I remember coming into the HRC and they were on the tail end of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going through that process. So that's why that sticks out to me for some crazy reason. But thank you. We would definitely appreciate looking at that and just kind of seeing how to improve that, make that stronger, or not go back to something that's not going to be sufficient enough for the community's standpoint and what they expect from the Oversight Commission. So thank you. Any other questions, comments in regards to the overall material or information that's been submitted? I understand. So if I understand the subgroup's goal is to make a decision or an incorporating due to the lack of time and the time that it takes and not doing this towards the end and all that kind of stuff, you want to consider making a decision on items 1, 2, and 3. Is that how I understand it, or am I confused on that?
What we were thinking was if we could get either a decision or a consensus about this, the overall approach, not necessarily line by line, but, is this a good working document? And if so, if we could agree to section 1 to get started, and then we could see if somebody would like to draft it. So that's how we were thinking about the decision making.
You want to oppose to looking at section 1 and using that as the basis of how we formulate this going forward? I mean, if anyone has anything better or something they can add to it, or some input, I like what I see personally, but I'm interested to hear if anyone has anything else to add to that.
Question. Are we talking about the idea of section 1, or are we talking about the content of section 1? That this is what section 1 will include? Is that what you mean, or do you mean the actual a draft of section 1?
Well, sections 1, 2, and 3 aren't going to have any recommendations. So I think they can be drafted when we're ready, and people can make additions. You know, if the person who's drafting it, you know, when we choose somebody to draft it, you can send comments to them, or, you know, their draft can be added to. We're trying to find a way. Another part of the suggestion about this approach is so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time in the full group. But if you've got a specific suggestion, you don't need to be shy. You can mention it.
I noticed that section 1 says present recommendations. So
That's as the purpose.
Yeah, so you're not going to go beyond that.
The recommendations are section 4.
Oh, okay.
The content of the recommendations.
Right. So the purpose of this enterprise is
to present recommendations.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's fine.
It's pretty darn obvious, but it's important to have it there so people can see it.
Okay, I can't object to the obvious.
Sorry about that.
Chuck.
Yes, Commissioner Tyler, is that you?
Yeah, just a comment that I appreciate the framework, and I think it provides an excellent roadmap in moving forward.
I would agree with you 1,000%. Any other comments? Is there any possible motions in regards to what you guys like and want to make a decision on by chance? Yes, Commissioner Harrell, please. You're muted.
Motion to accept the draft outline as proposed by the subcommittee regarding sections 1, 2, 3, and 4.
So moved. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Tyler. In regards to that approval of sections 1, 2, and 3 as an outline proposal.
He did all 4.
Yeah.
Oh, you did all 4. Excuse me. I apologize. 1, 2, 3, and 4, seconded by Commissioner Tyler. Is there any more discussion on the motion? All those in favor of approving the motion for items 1, 2, 3, and 4 submitted by the subgroup in regards to the outline, all say aye with your hands, please. Any opposed? So moved. So we'll be incorporating that one.
We were suggesting that we might see if somebody wants to draft section 1, which we see as pretty brief, and we can't include the input from the community. There's some input from the community already, but obviously not a lot. But if somebody would like to start that, that would move us forward. And we've thought that the full study committee should make the decisions about who the drafters are for the different sections. We thought that was important enough to bring to the full group.
Understood. Is there anyone who is interested in drafting that section? We need the writers. We need the writers on to step up for us here. You know,
it's the shortest section.
Because we've incorporated, so we're going to be committed to it until things change. So I'm looking for at least 1 or 2 volunteers, maybe to work in tandem, possibly.
I'll be one of the volunteers.
Thank you, Commissioner Tyler, for stepping up. Is anyone else interested in the section 1 drafting item and working with Commissioner Tyler?
Just one quick question. I know one of the questions that came up for us was drafting and revising the report without violating Open Meetings Act. What does that look like for folks who are going to be working on actually writing the report piece of things. Do we have any idea?
I don't have a clear idea, but I do know when you are editing and revising, I don't see how that is a violation in regards to writing a report. But you know, that's what my understanding is. Can anyone else jump in and add to that from their understanding as far as that concern? Yeah, I didn't think so. So does that help you out, Commissioner Callwood?
Yeah.
We're good to go. And it would be appropriate if you're sitting at home and you thought of something that you want to give to Commissioner Tyler. You certainly can do that. And if you want to be official, you can send it to Diane, and Diane can disseminate it for you as well, so you stay clear with everything when it comes to that. If anyone does choose to do an input on that.
So one thing I would stress about that is don't respond everybody to it and then have back and forth dialogue. So if Commissioner Callwood sends Paige out and says, this is my draft before a meeting, and then people start responding to it before the meeting, that's a problem. But if it's one-way communication from Commissioner Callwood saying, this is my draft for you guys to review, we can discuss it at the meeting, that's okay. But people shouldn't start sending emails to each other and then keep responding back and forth to them, because that's deliberation. So as long as you avoid that.
George?
Thank you for,
sorry.
Thank you for that clarification. City Manager Lahanas, did you have something to say, Commissioner Root?
Just a follow-up question to what George said. If I said to Quentin, I'd be happy to look at your draft, can we do that?
So if it stays in a group that's not a quorum,
fine.
Then that's my understanding. If we stay in a
Okay,
group
that's helpful clarification. It's also true that I'd be willing to look at a draft, Quentin. I think we're making good progress.
We know that all too well, Commissioner Root. All right, so as far as the item 1, I think we got that kind of understood. Are we going to be talking or doing anything with 2 or 3 or 4 right now at this moment, and how we're going about that? We're going to leave that alone right now? Okay, I just want to make sure I understand what you guys want to do or don't want to do. All right, so we all done with item 3.1, or is there anything more that we wanted to talk about in regards to that?
I think I think one of the things that we do have to talk about later on is just the December schedule. So having a timeline for Commissioner Tyler to also work on as well, and something that's realistic. And so I guess once we figure out when the next meeting is, perhaps that's when we can have somewhat of a draft, or the meeting after. I'm just kind of not sure again, so we can kind of keep the ball rolling. But I'm not sure how we can decide that altogether.
Yes, and just a reminder to commissioners, when you do speak, just please state who you are. So for minutes and all that kind of stuff, I hate to be a stickler on that. I try to recognize everyone when they do talk, Commissioner Callwood, but just, out of habit. But yes, I think we're on the same page, because that's going to be our discussion, item 3.2, that I added to the agenda to get some clarification on timelines and December and things like that. So I think we're on the same page with that. Before we move on, are we good with 3.1? All right, so let's move on to item 3.2.
Excuse me, Chuck?
Yes.
We did have somebody that was unable to join right away because they had difficulty finding the meeting ID, but we do have somebody who is interested in public comment if the committee would choose to hear that.
So I'll leave that up to the committee. I know we have quite a bit, but we also know how valuable it is to have input, and we haven't had much. So I think any input we can get is important, but that's up to you. So I would, by the raise of hands, is anyone not okay with caller calling in and speaking for that allotted 5 minutes? So I think we're go, Judge. I think we're go, Judge.
Can I add to that? He's actually wanting to do public comment after the presentation on use of force. He doesn't really want to do public comment right now.
Okay, so I think that would be a motion item then, if we wanted to change that structure. Am I correct with that, City Manager Lahanas, in regards to public comment in like that?
I mean, typically you would have to change your agenda to allow someone to sort of have a comment after the item because it comes at the beginning of your meeting. But that's up to, I mean, you could always comment at the next public meeting about what came last time. So.
Understood. I just want to be sensitive to the Zoom limitations and just, sometimes people can't call in or getting in. And, I just really, not to disagree with you just in regards to why that's important, but just with being accommodating with just the challenge of our format would be the only thing I'd say to that. But just
controlling the timing of your comments to have it sequenced in a certain meeting should be at the pleasure of this commission, and not someone shouldn't just jump in and change your meeting schedule for you, but that's up to the commission.
Understood. And so the question is to the commission. I would just like to open it up just for a quick, 10, 15 second discussion about what you're interested in doing with the caller. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
In the interest of facilitating public comment, which is not nearly reached the point of being disruptive at this point, I would move to allow this.
Is there a second to Commissioner Williams' a motion to allow the caller to call in after the presentations? Seconded by Commissioner Josephson. Any more discussion on that motion? All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please raise your hand. All right, seeing none, motion passes. So we'll add that public comment. Sorry, here, let me get caught up in my agenda here. So that would be item 4.3, public comments. Is that correct, how you see it, Justin?
Yes, I can prepare for public comment after the two presentations.
Thank you. So we'll add in that 4.3 for the motion that was just passed. All right. Thank you for that clarification. All right. So we are now, I believe, at item 3.2, and we're going to be talking in regards to kind of like our meetings going forward in December and timelines that Commissioner Callwood brought up. I would like to open it up to first off to City Manager Lahanas about kind of really what our options are possibly with next month. I know you're going to get back to us and let us know what our parameters were. And I know Diane was looking at it as well.
I thought we had the one date, and I don't know if we had other dates available, but Diane and Justin could tell us that. Did we have other dates besides the one Monday? Because we already have a one Monday set, right?
Yeah, so our regular meeting is on the 14th, and we were proposing doing another meeting on the 7th. And I looked at both calendars, and the only other meeting on the 7th is at 1 o'clock during the day.
And for additional confirmation, I do have a reservation on the city's Zoom calendar already for both the 7th and the 14th.
So the group looks like they can meet on the 7th as well, if that's the pleasure of the group.
Correct. All right, so let's talk about that for a quick second. I know a couple of commissioners will not be able to attend. I think it was Commissioner Callwood and maybe one other person possibly. Outside of that, is there anyone else that has where that's just a bad date when it comes to maybe possibly meeting on the 7th? Okay. All right. So, so as I understand it, we have the option, guys and gals, for making a motion for having an additional meeting added on the 7th of December 2020 for our subgroup. Yes, City Manager Lahanas.
Just a quick caution is I would plan in advance what you want to see at those meetings, because if on the 7th you ask for stuff, it will not be possible typically to get information because we want it posted by Wednesday. So that gives a day turnaround for staff. So if there's any presentations or anything like that, or if that meeting is for a particular purpose, I would lay that out now, because we may not be able to accommodate such a tight turnaround, obviously, with a day turnaround.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. Yes, Vice Chair Williams, and then I believe Commissioner Callwood.
Yes, Vice Chair Williams here. I do recall earlier we had talked about making one of these meetings in December a really an open forum for public speaking, again, for the comments. Is that something that's still on the table, or has this changed a little bit?
I believe it was open. And this is my own personal view of it. It seems like right now with where we're at and what we're working on, and it's kind of, I think it's hard for the public to really weigh in on something that we haven't really got to a certain point. And so for me, I was thinking possibly of looking at that kind of format a little bit later on after December, but that's just how I've been thinking about it, due to the lack there of participation that we've had so far. But again, I'm very interested to hear what other people would have to say in regards to that. You're muted, Mrs. Hardy. Oh, okay. Okay. Any other input on that to Commissioner or Vice Chair Williams's question? Yes, Commissioner Root, you're muted.
Just very quickly, December 14 is no other meeting shows up on the city calendar, but there is a major meeting of the school board that probably you could expect 100 people to be at. So that was one reason that we thought it would be a really bad idea to have a public input session on that particular day.
How does everyone feel about getting the maximum participation from the community as early as December? Do you feel that, do you agree with me? Do you disagree, in regards to that concern and possibly have a little bit more for them to comment on in our process?
Yes.
Yes, Vice Chair Williams, and then Commissioner Tyler.
I do agree with you in the regards that we should have more information for them to be able to have a thorough interaction between us.
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Tyler. Okay. So yeah, I'm with you on that. So when we talk about separate from that, the 7th, what do we, going back to City Manager Hannes's concern about getting turnaround time and what do we want to get done at that meeting? I'm curious to hear from you about what we are going to have this extra meeting that we didn't have planned before and what you want to get done and who you want to see possibly do it. Yes, Commissioner Harrell.
My understanding from last meeting had been that because there was so much to talk about, we were going to spend today on use of force, and then the next meeting was going to be discussing the complaint system process. So that's what I was anticipating for December 7th.
And thank you for reminding me of that. That's exactly what I was thinking as well, because we had kind of really committed to that with the commitments from staff and doing the presentation. So is everyone kind of in agreement with that tentative plan? That's what we kind of really want to focus on, is that presentation from them and focusing on complaints and the history of complaints and all that kind of stuff and that topic?
It would
anyone disagree with that, to say?
It may be useful also to clarify what you'd want the 14th then, because we would have brought the presentation to the 14th instead. So what would you do on the 14th? Because once we get to the 7th, we won't have time likely to prepare anything for the 14th. So you may have to give us 2 weeks of what you want to see. So
and I'm asking generally here, City Manager Hannes and Deputy Chief and Chief, what do you tell us in regards to the presentation that we're looking for in December and the time that we're at now in 7th or the 14th? How are you looking at that being appropriate to your other commitments and presenting to us? How does that work for you?
I'd ask the chief that.
I think the deputy chief mentioned that he could be ready on the 7th. That's a possibility. So that's a 2-week turnaround, but I think we got notified a couple weeks ago, reference some things on the agenda. So I think the deputy chief was putting some stuff together with both these back-to-back presentations. So I think we could be ready on the 7th.
So our primary focus will be that, the presentation and our discussion and the information will be that for the 7th, from what I understand. And then going to the second part of that on the 14th, I know that a couple of commissioners kind of had some people in mind. kind of wanted to have some things done by that time. Can I get some input about what you would like to see or what you're interested in focusing on the 14th of December meeting? Which is really important for us to kind of really have an idea because of the turnaround time, because of that meeting happening. Then we have holidays and we'll have a gap of time. So I really would like to hopefully that meeting to really have a lot of stuff for us to walk away with, to come back with substantial amount of research work or focus when it comes to that. Commissioner Hurrell.
Yeah, sorry. If I go back to the tentative work plan from a few meetings ago, what we had for the 21st, which I assume would now be the 14th, was presentations from Black Lives Matter and the Community Mental Health Association of Michigan. So if those are still possibilities, if those are things that the rest of the committee thinks are appropriate for that time, I don't know how much we would get in terms of product, workable content out of those meetings, but that might represent an avenue for us to start getting different forms of community input, at the very least, if not from the overall public, from some important stakeholders in the community.
Couldn't agree with you more. I thank you for referring back to that. That's helpful. I really like the community health aspect and really trying to get some learnings from that and understandings. I know, for example, our department has incorporated, some mental health aspects to what they want to do going forward, and understanding that would be helpful, I think. And I know Commissioner Williams had talked about maybe some things within that realm as well. For me personally, as much as I appreciate Black Lives Matter and what they bring to the table, I feel like, just like the public comment, I feel like we're not quite there yet to ask them what we want to know from them in regards to kind of really making it beneficial to our conversation or discussion. But I think that's, just my personal view on it all when it comes to the order of presenters to the group. But I definitely am very interested in exploring the topics of the community health part that we had on that previous work plan. Any other comments in regards to that? Commissioner Root.
Well,
and Commissioner Garcia.
First.
I think it's important that we don't pick one or the other. I think we pick both. I mean, to hear from, and at this point, I know I understand the anxiety that we're not ready, but I think this commission, this oversight committee, was put together for transparency purposes and to hear the public, and we haven't really done that yet outside of 2 or 3 public comments. So I think we just need to open it up, and whether we're ready or not, and hear from the community. And I don't think we take one and not the other. I think we take them both.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia Jr. Any follow-up comments to that input? Yes, Commissioner Root.
Another possibility is going down that work plan that Cedric referred to. Municipal liability insurer and MCOLs are also on the list, where we'd be mostly looking for input from them. They wouldn't be responding to things about our deliberations. And it is the middle of December, so it might be difficult to get somebody to make a commitment. So I think maybe we could, have a couple of folks as possibilities for that time and start to work on who'd be available on the 14th, understanding that we'd get to other people later.
Thank you, Commissioner Root. Yes, City Manager Lahanas.
Another thought was that it was mentioned by a commissioner during our first meeting, the possibility of looking at a public survey as a way of providing public input. So we've been sort of trying to gather information. We got some information from Commissioner Hurrell, and the police department has been looking for stuff from the Department of Justice on public safety, sort of community, community feedback that you could have sort of broadly done by a phone survey. And that's something the city has a pretty strong interest in doing. So perhaps we can share our progress on that, hear your thoughts on that meeting, and talk, and looking at that as a way of providing broader public input, because we haven't gotten too much input so far. And you're right that maybe if people have something to respond to, public input could be more meaningful, but maybe looking at a community survey might be something that's worthwhile because it was raised by the commission as well. And it's something we're also looking at and interested in as well.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. Can I just ask, so the community survey, and I know you said you're looking into it. How does that work with our involvement? Are we going to be a part of that process, and like what questions will be asked, or how's that working in your mind?
Yeah, that's certainly something we can share and hear your input and hear your feedback. We don't have a survey yet. We have some drafts of some. Like I said, it came up from Commissioner Garcia, and we asked Commissioner Haro because of his background in research methods. This is something I had a strong interest in because council had talked about the need to improve police-community relations over time. And we've taken a lot of steps, this commission being one of them, but a lot of steps. And I wish we could have had a benchmark of our police-community relations perceptions 6 months ago, but we don't. So could we do one now and then do one in 2 years and then do one 2 years later over time so we can try to measure if we're able to move the dial on police-community relations in an objective way. So hiring a firm, we've used Epic MRA in the past to do community surveys. They've been broad citywide surveys, not focusing only on public safety. This would be envisioned focusing on public safety. So certainly I would like to hear your thoughts and input and feedback, and not do a survey from the city and then have you say, I wish you would have looked at this one issue, which would be a waste of money for our perspective. But like I said, we heard it from here as well. We asked Commissioner Haro because of his research background, and it seems like a good fit. Something we've already been talking about internally. It seems like a good fit to hear about it here, hear your feedback, look at the questions, see what your thoughts are on it. So maybe we can talk about that. And also it's a good way to get public input by going out to people instead of having them come here. Maybe they're not coming here, but maybe we can go out and hear feedback from 400 residents that are a cross section of the community. In the past, we've done these as a a sort of demographically and geographically diverse group by research methods people saying this is a valid survey of East Lansing's, temperature, so to speak. So that might be something you'd want to consider for that conversation.
I love it. Yeah, so I think we have kind of a workable Commissioner, City Manager Lahanas. Yes, Councilman Bacon.
Yes, then along the lines of what Chris was doing with the outline, with each, like George's new item here, kind of what would the Oversight Commission do with said survey, then feeds into the outline moving forward of where that fits into the plan, rather than like is that going to be something that the actual seated commission is going to review, look at where our stat, and then present something for council. What do we do long term with that data would be a good question to answer along the way, and maybe that can be placed somewhere in that framework of where that happens and what goes on, so it doesn't just get lost in the sauce here. So that's it.
Duly noted. Appreciate that input. I'm sure the subgroup will take that into consideration. So from what I understand, we kind of really have a workable for the 7th and 14th. I just need to formulate the agenda and then, converse, make sure that we're in alignment with that. Is that where we're at now with that? Okay. Any more discussion on item 3.2 in regards to our meetings going forward in the next, at least short term, and the structure of them? All right, thank you. Let's move on to item number 4, staff reports, city manager information on comparable cities. It looks like City Manager Lahanas has gave us a robust list to work with. Can you help us out with that?
Sure. So the first document, it's a lot of information, but I'll just sort of walk you through a little bit of it, and I'm not going to do a presentation because it's more just resources for you. But I had a graduate intern last spring. I wanted to sort of see what the state of different cities were around Michigan and around the Big Ten. So I had sort of the research done. I told you before that Public Act 312 is the Labor Relations Act of Michigan that provides for public safety for binding arbitration. So you have to set up comparable communities. So that list of comparable communities are communities that in an arbitration process were found to be comparable to East Lansing. That means that in some way the population, the taxable value, the type of community were found to be relevant in a conversation about our labor agreements and through an arbitration process. So that doesn't mean that every city is exactly like East Lansing. Obviously, Ann Arbor and Lansing get pretty big and Jackson gets a bit smaller, but they give you, when you look at a range of cities, it gives you sort of an estimate of what pay, benefits, and contracts should look like as it relates to public safety. So that's why I came up with that list of comparable cities. There's nothing magical to it. That's where the list came from. There's also Michigan State University thrown in there. That's because they're a nearby partner, obviously. They are not a comparable community because they're not a city. So when you look at that list, you'll see it. An interesting thing about this list is, and the next list as well I'll touch upon, is when you go by population from small to big, you'll see that their solutions to police oversight get larger when the department gets larger. They have more resources and therefore more oversight and probably greater expectations of oversight. So the next one I'll go to, you have to scroll down quite a ways to that chart with a really small print. And then you'll get to the Big 10 cities. Starts with College Park with 32,000, goes all the way up to Columbus with 879,000. And then again, it goes by population in order. Again, it's interesting because when you're at the smaller cities, you have very little in the form of police oversight, but as you get to the big cities, that's where you have more and more robust oversight. So interesting to you, perhaps because it shows a summary of what things look like. Then you go back to the actual policies. If you want to see a policy that I thought, we touched upon Ann Arbor before. Ann Arbor is a policy that when you read through it, it's 10 pages. It's not long. It's not even 10 pages. Maybe it's 8 pages. But it gives you a notion of some of the trade-offs and some of the considerations that went into putting that policy together, about the timing of the investigation, about the authority of the commission, about the review of confidential information, about how binding that sort of information, their recommendation is to the chief or to the city administrator. All of that stuff is weaved into the Ann Arbor policy. I'm not saying it's the right policy decisions for East Lansing or not, but I'm just saying as you read that document through, you will see all the things that we talk about touched upon through that policy document. So it's a good one to sort of look at and say, oh, this is how Ann Arbor is handling it. So again, not that you're going to take their exact policy, but all the things we touch upon, labor issues, the authority of the city charter and how this plays upon the city charter authority, all of those issues about does an officer need to speak to a commission, the review of evidence are all touched upon. So you're certainly welcome to read all of them. It's good information. If you were to read one, I would say Ann Arbor, just because it has lots of the sorts of things to touch upon that we've already talked about and that you've heard about. But I don't want to take too much time because Deputy Chief Gonzalez has a thorough presentation, but I just wanted to provide that to you. Like I said, this is information that I gathered because I thought it'd be useful to sort of get a look at the landscape of Michigan cities and Big 10 cities to see what other cities do in regards to police review and oversight. That's all I've got unless anyone has any questions for me. I can't hear you, Chair.
Sorry, I was muted, so but I don't see anyone having any specific questions to the information. Thank you for compiling this. I do have a comment though. I got a chance to look at a good chunk of them, and I say this respectfully, but I see a lot of things of what not to do when it comes to what we would like to do here in East Lansing and how it's been set up. And I won't identify any cities or anything like that, but it definitely was helpful for me to go through some of that and just get a basic idea and understanding of kind of really what's going on around us and what may be working, what isn't working, and how these have changed over time. I'm curious to see. So thank you for that. I think we'll move on. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I was part of that group that was working up some profiles of cities, and I spent all my time doing my little cities, and I haven't really looked too much at the cities that Mr. Lahanis did and Ms. Josephson. My experience going through this material is that each place is different, and it's kind of fascinating how these things develop and the little wrinkles that they all that they have. And you know, the NACO people tell us that there are 2 models or 3 models, and you have to pick a model. But I didn't see any models there. I saw individual cities with histories and different ways of skinning the cats that they had to skin. So I'd like to have some time to go through all these cities on all these lists and see it. And I would encourage others to do that, because these places are fascinating and they're all different. And you know, there ain't no models. There's just local conditions.
I couldn't agree with you more, Commissioner Williams. And my eyes were this big with some of the stuff that I was looking at and just kind of how it got to that and what they decided. And so I would second the fact that if you get a chance, please go through that and take a good look at it. And we'd be interested to hear, what you think of it, hopefully in the next meeting or so, and some feedback on that. Anything else before we move on? All right, item 4.2, East Lance Police Department presentation on the use of force. And I'll open it up to Deputy Chief Gonzalez and Chief Johnson.
All right, good evening again. Yep, Justin is going to share the screen and help me scroll through this. I am going to go through this and with an eye that there are going to be probably a lot of questions afterwards. So I'm certainly going to try and time this so we have plenty of time to respond to questions and clarifications for everybody. So if we could go to the next screen. So just some objectives with tonight's presentation. We're obviously going to talk about our standing response to resistance policy, some of the training with use of force that our officers undergo on an annual basis. We will talk about the MCOL's use of force continuum, or what they call the subject control continuum. That is in this presentation, but it is very difficult to read in a PowerPoint. So there is a copy of the continuum attached to your agendas tonight for your review. We'll talk about use of force reporting procedures and review procedures as well. We talked a little bit about it earlier, some of the room for opportunity and areas where we need to improve in those reporting procedures. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well again. And then I'm going to talk about data and how we capture it, how we extract it from the system, and make some recommendations to you all where we see room for growth again as well. We can go to the next slide. So we'll talk about our policy. Our response to resistance policy is policy 20-12. That policy was also included in your agenda packets as well. It contains definitions, a couple of case law examples that are very germane and very specific to use of force. And this is United States Supreme Court case law that dictates how police officers can and cannot use force. We'll talk about non-deadly and deadly force. Again, documentation, medical treatment, some responsibilities of officers and the first line supervisors. We'll talk about weapons, and then training and assessment on those techniques and those weapons that officers have available to them. So applicable case law. First, we're going to start way back with the Fourth Amendment. Because an arrest is a seizure, and therefore any use of force can be constituted as a seizure. So an officer must establish probable cause to make an arrest. When I say probable cause, a lot of people say, well, what is that? What is the threshold of probable cause? It's more likely than not that the incident or the crime occurred. If you want a definition, that is a very general and widely used definition of probable cause. Next, we'll talk about two very specific cases that deal with use of force. Every police officer out there should be able to recite these almost by heart. The first one is Tennessee v. Garner. This case comes out of the United States Supreme Court, and it specifically talks about the use of deadly force. So officers may use deadly force against a violent offender when they pose a serious bodily threat or a deadly threat to officers or others. One of the things, just gonna move my screen here. One of the things that Tennessee v. Garner did abolish was the use of deadly force against non-violent felony offenders. And it laid out this next term, that an officer's use of deadly force is limited to those situations where the officer has probable cause, again, to believe that a felon poses a threat of serious physical harm to themselves or to the public. Let's go to the next case. This one's Graham v. O'Connor, and this one really talks about the use of non-deadly force against an individual. But the big thing with Graham is that it laid out the objectively reasonable clause, meaning that any force used by a police officer has to be used and it has to be judged from an objectively reasonable standard. The tricky thing with this, and I'm the farthest thing from a lawyer, so please excuse my very basic explanation of this, is that the court stated that the reasonable test is not capable of a precise definition or mechanical application. What does that mean? So when you look at, how you put that definition or that statement into practice, Graham did lay out 3 very specific things that have to be considered by a police officer prior to force being used. 1, the severity of the crime. Next, whether or not the suspect poses an immediate threat to officers or the public. And then the third one, which is probably the most common condition that officers encounter and have to make a determination on, is whether the suspect is actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest. Okay. Go to the next slide. So we'll talk about deadly force within our policy and how it's laid out. So deadly force is authorized when an honest and reasonable belief that the use of deadly force is necessary to prevent imminent threat or imminent death or great bodily harm to oneself or another. What we have to be cognizant of when we talk about deadly force or even non-deadly force is that we are judging this from the officer's perspective at the time that the incident is occurring. The courts have said that the officer doesn't have the ability or the advantage of hindsight. So when judging whether or not use of force is justified, you have to look at it from the totality of the circumstances of when the incident occurred. Before using a firearm, an officer should attempt to identify themselves and, if feasible, state their intention to shoot. In practice, how does this work? On the range, our officers go through a bunch of different types of drills to become proficient with their firearms. And one of the drills that we run is a challenge drill where the range instructor gives a command, and the officers prior to shooting have to give a warning to simulate that they're warning the individual to stop, to drop their gun, whatever the direction may be, before the officer has to shoot. Our policy does prohibit warning shots, so we do not shoot at somebody or something to just give them a warning and scare them, if you will, to stop their action. And then this next one is a pretty big one that I think we see play out in the media from body camera video quite often, that the refusal of a driver to stop a vehicle is not considered justification for discharging a firearm. So we don't shoot at moving vehicles just because they're running away from us. That is different, though, if the vehicle is turned into a weapon and the officer is in immediately life-threatening danger. Go to the next one. This is about non-deadly force. So officers can use, in accordance to Graham, non-deadly force in defense of themselves or another to prevent a person from injuring themselves, and obviously to effect an arrest of either a passively or actively resisting person. And I'll talk about some of those definitions in a minute when we get to the subject control continuum. Officers can also use force to control, direct, or arrest persons creating a public disturbance. And they can use force to take a person into protective custody. So if the person is an immediate threat to themselves, or is requiring some type of a medical or mental health evaluation and are meeting a threshold of a person requiring treatment, the officer can use the same force as they could use in a misdemeanor arrest to take that person into protective custody to get them the help that they need. Medical treatment. So our policy also states that, when and where medical treatment should be provided to an injured person, especially when that injury comes from our use of force. Of course, if the injury is caused by a firearm, or the injury is beyond what is expected of the use of force. So if I tackle somebody and they're complaining of significant arm pain, and you see a deformity in their arm or swelling in their arm from the tackle, then we need to give them immediate medical attention. That can be done either on scene or even here at the East Lansing Police Department once they're transferred to the jail. The supervisor also has oversight, and it is not uncommon for a supervisor to arrive on scene, observe an injury, and request paramedics to come to the scene to provide that medical aid for an injured person. Anytime an individual requests medical treatment, we have to give them medical treatment. That's irregardless whether it's on the street or here at the jail. If someone says, I want to see a paramedic or I need medical help, then we call the paramedics to the scene and let them evaluate them. The use of a taser is a mandatory medical treatment situation where anybody that is tased, whether it's with the probes or with what we call a drive stun, where you physically touch the person with the taser, they are required to be medically cleared at the ER before they're lodged in the jail. And that's obvious for obvious reasons. The taser uses electricity, and obviously you want to get someone checked out and make sure that they're not suffering from any lasting effects of being tased. And then a less lethal device or impact munition. So think a sponge round or any type of riot control dispersal device that could be deployed. People are required to be medically cleared to make sure that they don't have any significant lasting injury from that device. Use of force review. This is a big one, and some of these things have changed recently because we identified holes in our system that needed to be shored up so that we were doing a thorough and accurate review of our officers' use of force. So upon applying force in a situation, an officer has to do an immediate report to the supervisor, to the on-duty supervisor. So in that situation where I went out and I had to tackle somebody, as soon as I'm in a safe position to do so, I have to make sure that I'm telling my supervisor, hey boss, I had to tackle this individual. It was a use of force and I'm going to document it. So complete that written report and document their use of force, not just what they did, but the individual's actions as well. The first line supervisor on the shift, whether it's the sergeant or a lieutenant, has to report that use of force to police administration by the end of their shift. That allows for an administrative review within 12 hours of the use of force being applied. The administrative review takes a look at the circumstances, the police report, the video, all of that information, and then makes a call whether or not that use of force was done justly and within policy. If it's not within policy, then we can initiate a administrative inquiry to make a determination whether or not the officer violated policy and to what extent. On top of that, we are currently doing a weekly report to the city manager, which ultimately gets routed to the city council, just documenting our use of force as well. Go to the next screen. The next one I want to talk about, the next big thing that I want to talk about is this duty to intervene. The language, we've always had a duty to intervene in our policy, in our use of force policy, but the language has recently, just over the summer, been strengthened because what we found is that our original language allowed for an out, if you will, for an officer not to intervene in an excessive force situation. It essentially had a clause in there that said, if feasible. And you can see our language here that requires an immediate intervention to de-escalate and control the amount of force used if they are seeing an excessive amount of force used by another police officer or another employee. And then, of course, there's a reporting requirement as well to that. So we've strengthened that language to essentially just make it a shall. You have no option. There is no way out of not intervening if you witness excessive force being used or applied by an individual. I'll talk about our training real briefly. We have a use of force staff here at the police department that consists of 1 lieutenant, 2 sergeants, and 4 police officers. They are instructors in all sorts and manners of use of force, whether it's firearms, physical controls, less lethal, pepper spray, taser, those types of things. And that staff is responsible for putting on 4 to 6 training sessions annually that can last anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. To kind of give you a genesis of how our use of force training has evolved over the last 20 years. When I started here in 1997, most of our use of force days were going out to the range and we would shoot at paper targets, and we would do that all day long. Now what we've done is we have expanded that into not just using firearms or the intermediate control devices like a taser, PCA, pepper spray, or even the physical controls, the PPCT controls that we are trained in. But we are starting to dovetail that with scenario-based training, so that staff sets up a scenario or a series of scenarios that allows the police officer to walk into a common type of call that they may respond to on the street here in East Lansing and practice everything from their de-escalation techniques to their use of force techniques, to their communication skills, those types of things. And the scenarios are supposed to be designed so that if the officer is properly applying de-escalation techniques, the actors in the scenario will back down and become compliant for the most part. And if they don't, then they could the officer's actions could actually ratchet up the scenario, just like what we see on in the real world when the officers are out on the road. They talk about policy and legal matters, and then also there is an annual qualification requirement that all police officers, from the chief on down, we all have to go through a qualification every year in all of the techniques that we are trained in. So that's firearms, physical controls, control devices, those types of things. Can we go to the next slide? I'll take a second here to talk about this subject and control continuum. And one of the things I do want to stress before we really get into it is that this continuum is not law. This is a training guideline published by the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, MPOLS, and it is used and taught at the police academy level and then continues on with an officer throughout their career. So the officers are introduced to it at that very basic level and continue to train on it, stay up to date with any changes that MPOLS makes to it and all the standards that go along with it. And if we can go to the next slide. One thing I want to point out to everybody is there's a lot of information on this page. But if you go down to the bottom where it says totality of circumstances, this is where we get back to that objectively reasonable standard that is set forth in the Graham case. And when we talk about whether or not an officer's force is justified, the question is whether the officer's actions are objectively reasonable in light of all the facts and circumstances confronting the officer at the time the force is used. So we're judging this from the time the force is used, not with the benefit of hindsight. And that is the standard that's been set forth by the Supreme Court. Justin, can we go back one slide real quick? Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so on the continuum, I think most people have seen this or seen a version of this, but it really is a very basic continuum that shows subject action versus officer response. On the far left, on the very bottom, it says officer verbal presence or officer presence and verbal direction. The mere presence of a police officer at a scene can be termed as a very low level of use of force. Officer giving verbal direction is the very first step. Should seem, like it's common sense, but sometimes it's not. When an officer tells somebody to do something, that can be termed as a lesson or as a use of force. As the subject's actions increase to passive resistance, think, I'm not going to leave, I'm just going to sit here, and you're going to have to drag me if you want me to move, to active resistance, where the individual is running away, pushing away, not providing the officers, their hands for handcuffing. That is termed as active resistance, and you see the corresponding officer response on the bottom. To active aggression, think the individual is trying to assault the police officer, all the way up to deadly force. And this is a sliding continuum. So an officer could arrive on scene and, in theory, immediately have to move to deadly force if the situation calls for it. If the situation calls for intermediate controls, but we don't necessarily get a chance to apply any of those controls and an individual backs down, then the officer's response should be backing down that continuum. To give you kind of a scenario of how something like that would happen is if an officer shows up on scene, an individual is actively aggressive but has not made physical contact with the officer yet, and the officer displays a taser and says, stop your action or I'm going to tase you, and the individual becomes compliant, then the officer has to back down as well. So it's a sliding scale. We can go forward 2 slides, Justin. Here we go. So how do we capture some of this data? We talked a little bit about it earlier. It is an imperfect system. We have been looking, just like I think everybody else, we've been looking at these early warning systems. I've talked about Blue Team. It seems to me like it's kind of the gold standard out there for early warning and use of force reporting systems. We also looked at benchmark analytics recently, and we looked at Guardian tracking. We went through webinars with all 3 of these companies. And there are a lot of benefits to moving to a system like that, not just as an early warning indicator for an individual or an employee that might be having problems, but as a way to better capture our use of force data and be able to report that back out to whether it's the Oversight Commission, whether it's the community at large, or whether we use it internally here to be able to guide our training, guide where we need to do better. Some of these systems can be very expensive. Guardian tracking was around Blue Team was around $16,000. The other systems were a little bit cheaper. So, we definitely see a value in that and see a way forward in getting better and tracking our data and reporting our data out with a system like that. Currently, some of the categories that we capture, and I just want to give definitions for this because it can be a little deceiving or confusing. Handgun use and display, rifle use and display. Use, common sense. If a round is discharged from that weapon, that is a use. A display is taking the weapon out of its holster, or if it's a long gun, a rifle in one of our patrol cars, if we pull that out of the patrol car, that is a display and it has to be reported. And the circumstances surrounding that display have to justify it as well. Taser use and display, again, very similar. Taser use can be in 2 manners. One, it can be with that drive stun where the taser is touched to the individual or physical contact is made, or a deployment of the probes where the probes actually come out and impact the person, and that's how the taser is employed. The display, if it comes unholstered, it's got to be reported. PCA or personal chemical agent pepper spray is the exact same thing. The next 2, I'll skip to physical controls. That's where an officer is putting their hands on an individual. That could be everything from a tackle, because someone is running from the officer, evading arrest, they have to be tackled, be stopped, to a pressure point technique. You know, their officers are trained where there's pressure points behind your ears or up underneath your jawline, and they are trained in using those pressure points to gain what's called pain compliance from an individual. So physical controls, officer putting their hands on somebody. And then non-arrest handcuffing. I do want to touch on this because you see a lot of this in some of our use of force reporting. Officers can legally detain an individual and handcuff them without arresting them, bringing them to jail, and charging them with a crime. This could be for a number of reasons, whether it's an officer safety concern, whether it's a situation where they need to gain control of a scene and detain individuals to actually start their investigation to determine what actually occurred. Scenes, obviously, we know can be extremely chaotic, and that is a way to gain control over a scene and keep people from escalating the situation. There are also situations where we might handcuff an individual that has an arrest warrant from another agency, and we detain them while we're making contact with that other agency to make a determination whether or not the agency is going to pick them up or we're going to transport them out to that location. Sometimes the other agency says no, advise them of the warrant and release them. So non-arrest handcuffing can occur in a lot of different scenarios. Go to the next slide. Get into some of our data here. I do want to make a very clear statement here that you're going to see handgun use and rifle use on the next two slides. In my 23 years here, we have not had to discharge our firearms at an individual, at a person. All of the handgun uses are officers discharging their firearm to put down an injured animal. We all know about the deer population here in East Lansing. A lot of deer get hit by cars, and sometimes an officer has to put the deer down. We also had a very robust rabid raccoon population in the city last year on the east side of town. Officers had to put animals down because they created a public safety thing. So that's where the uses come. Obviously, our displays, both in handgun and rifle displays, are higher than that. Justin, we can go to the next slide. And I'll just talk about displays real quickly. I know I touched on it before, but there are a lot of reasons that an officer may display a handgun or a rifle. Talked about clearing a building. If an officer has to go in and clear a house that may have been broken into or a business, you know, they're going to display their weapon. They have to document that in a report, so that's a display. If officers effect a felony stop, they're going to display their weapon and, you know, get people into custody during that felony stop. Felony stop, think like a traffic stop, where the officers don't actually make contact up with the vehicle, but they call the people out of the vehicle and bring them back to them. Let me go to the next one. Taser use and display. You can see the data there, and I've already talked about the two categories between the two. We clearly display our tasers a lot more than we ever use them, and I can tell you that you know, taser displays are very, very effective at gaining compliance from an individual. Can we go to the next slide? Pepper spray, you know, use and displays. We don't use pepper spray that often anymore. There's a lot of reasons for this. One, we have seen that individuals can have adverse effects from pepper spray, especially if it's hot in the summertime and you spray them, and then they, you know, have to go to jail or they have to sit in the back of your police car for a while. That can cause them a lot of physical reactions that sometimes just aren't safe for the individual. But also, I do want to touch on the point that the taser is a standoff device where an officer can stay approximately 20 feet away from an individual to avoid engaging in that physical conduct, that physical altercation. Where with pepper spray, if you're 8 feet away, you might get results if you deploy your pepper spray. There's also a contamination factor with that as well. So the taser is just that much more effective. Go to the next one. Non-arrest handcuffing, you can see that actually has climbed over the last 3 years. And, you know, that's something that we have to look into. Why is that occurring? Are we contacting that many more people? Are we handcuffing people that maybe we shouldn't handcuff? Maybe we just have them have a seat on the curb while we're dealing with them. But that one is fun. We'll go to the next slide. And then physical controls. You can see that our times that we are actually putting hands on an individual has declined a little bit over the last 3 years, not significantly, but it has declined. And we can go to the next one, and that is it. So I will open it up for questions. I know I went through that pretty briefly. I do want to make just kind of reiterate some of the things that I talked about early in the presentation when it comes to the legal standards, particularly Garner and the Graham cases. And then if anybody has any questions, certainly entertain those.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. I just want to acknowledge East Lansing Police Department for opening themselves up. Just, you know, I really appreciate the cooperation and conversation and just some different things that, you know, many of us haven't never seen before. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate the presentation in regards. There's a lot to unpack there, but, you know, thank you for doing that and taking the time out of your day and resources to do that presentation. So let's just start off with a couple of questions from some commissioners, if you have any, in regards to the presentation. Yes, Commissioner Williams, please.
Could you describe the de-escalation training and how that fits into the use of force?
Yes, we have 3 de-escalation instructors here on staff. One has gone through a company called Vistalar, which is kind of the standard around the country when it comes to de-escalation training. The other 2 have gone through a different company, but it's still in the same vein. One of the things that's taught in de-escalation is that people want to know, one, who you are, what your authority is, and why you are giving them the direction that they are being given. You know, I think we can all probably go to YouTube and watch, you know, body camera videos or, you know, cell phone videos of police officers just barking out orders, you know, do this, do this, do this. There might be a reason for that. There might be a legitimate reason. Follow my directions, and then we can talk once the scene is secure, everybody is safe. But quite often, let's think about a traffic stop for a reason, for a minute. Just a, you know, someone's speeding. There's no immediate threat to life or safety issue there. Quite often, it's how you speak to people that de-escalation training teaches you. You know, years ago, there was verbal judo. That was kind of the course that people went to. And so de-escalation training really tries to teach officers how to speak to people and what information to give them to gain that verbal compliance so that it does not escalate to a physical altercation or an arrest that maybe doesn't need to be made, those types of things.
Are there different kinds of de-escalation at different points or in the force continuum?
Well, the continuum doesn't really address de-escalation. You know, I don't want to say it's a new topic, but it has come back around. De-escalation has kind of come back around, and it's really, it's on our shoulders to dovetail that into the training, to the use of force training. That goes to that scenario-based training. You know, and officers do get exposed to this at the police academy level as well. So in their basic training, they go through these, what we call, or what the academy calls, night problems. And they're just scenarios where the officers respond. The officer and the actors, you know, have a script, if you will, of how they respond to what the recruits are doing. And so it gives them a chance to practice that. Of course, you know, 15, 17 weeks in a police academy is not going to make you an expert at this. 20 years on a police department probably won't make you an expert at this. So it's a constant evolution, and it's a constant training effort that just, you know, recently we are, you know, really embracing to fold into our use of force program and not keep them separate. So we don't want officers sitting in a de-escalation training for 8 hours where it's death by PowerPoint. We want them to be able to actually integrate the tools that they've learned into a scenario, and hopefully that carries over onto their work at the street level.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. Commissioner Garcia Jr.
Deputy Chief, I understand that for the sake of this presentation, it was kind of a cursory look at the data, and I appreciate the data that you provided. Is there a way to extract from the data that you have race, gender of the subject, age, whether they're a citizen of East Lansing or not? I mean, it's important, as you can imagine, to this committee and moving forward that we're able to extract that information.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm glad you brought that up because I completely glossed over that in the presentation, because I did want to touch on that. Commissioner Grigsby had requested that data. Our current system cannot extract that by just running a report. We would have to go in and physically touch every single one of those use of force reports and hand tally demographic information. Another hole in our reporting system that we need to fix. And I can tell you my limited experience in sitting down with the 3 companies that I mentioned before all have that ability to extract that data. So extremely important, but not something that we can do very easily right now without opening up every single use of force report on any given year and doing a hand tally.
Well, I appreciate you acknowledging that it's a huge hole, because it is. I think we're all in agreement to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia Jr. We are on the same page with some of that thought process, and I appreciate you guys looking at that as a whole in what we need to have and what you need to have in regards to how to do what you do best. I had a couple of quick questions, and I, for the sake of time, I won't ask all of them, but I was just curious on item 12 point, excuse me, I take that back. On item 12.11, documenting the use of force. I know in the presentation you had talked about handguns and rifles. That has to be documented. But on this line here, it says, however, slug rifles do not require a use of force instant report. Can you speak to that at all? Or is that, has that changed, or what does that mean in difference?
Which letter was it?
Item 12.11.
Yep.
And we're looking at section B. On the data capture, it shows that you don't have to, does not require a use of force instant report on a slug rifle.
Yeah, so think of a slung rifle just hanging around an officer's neck. You know, the officers have to, I'll just really simplify this. An officer has to take their rifle to and from their patrol car every shift. They're going to sling their rifle, bring it into the station, store it. That's not a use of force. If an officer gets out of their vehicle and they have their rifle slung and they're using it in a law enforcement purpose, we expect them to create that use of force report to document it.
Yeah, it's a little, it's okay. Okay, and then for on item 12.10 and under medical treatment, I just got a couple of quick questions there, nothing too detailed, but it says when possible in item G, it says when possible, photographs of use of force related injuries will be taken. And I guess I'm just curious, it says when possible, what would be a justification of not doing that like as standard when it comes to someone being injured and documenting the injury?
You know, in my experience of just working here, I can't think of a scenario where it wouldn't be possible. It may not be possible to take a picture of the injury immediately, you know, when it occurred right on the street, but maybe transferred to the jail, a photograph is possible. At the hospital, photograph is possible. You know, there may be situations where an individual is being combative the entire time. I think, you know, that's few and far between. But I have personally had situations where an individual is combative on the street, they're combative in the ambulance, and they're combative with the hospital staff. Might be hard to actually take a picture of the injury, but if you think about that entire continuum, it is highly likely that there will always be an opportunity to take a picture and document the injury. Because, you know, someone's not just going to stop moving and, you know, hide behind a curtain or something like that the entire time you're with them.
Thank you. My last question, just for the sake of time, and being respectful to you guys this time as well. I'm struggling with this objectively reasonable, and I know it's you know, it's Supreme Court level and kind of really understanding that, but I'm just struggling with it. But I guess it goes back to when you have that training that you talked about, where you have 8 to 12 hours, 4 to 6 times a year. Is that training specific to individuals in what they need in the training level, or is it just a format that everyone walks through with a certain amount of time for this, certain amount of time for that, certain amount of time for that, or is it different from that in how you apply the training to officers?
If I understand your question right, all of our police officers, every sworn individual goes through the same training, because at the end of the day, you know, I sit behind this desk most of the day, but at the end of the day, I'm still required to be able to perform to those standards that are trained in our use of force training, just like a police officer on the street is. And so everybody is supposed to go through that same level of training. The objectively reasonable thing, I get it. And I saw Commissioner Heroux raise his hand. I don't know if you've got a better way to explain it, but yeah, it causes a little bit of heartache, because we all like very crisp, clean definitions of what we can and can't do. You know, don't give me the gray box. Give me a line. Give me, you know, a sandbox that I can play in, and it makes it a lot easier. But that definition just sometimes it's hard to grasp. So.
Yeah, and yes, Commissioner Heroux. I guess that's why I was asking about the training, and if with your policy and how things are going forward and how you guys are really evolving, is it something to consider, and maybe, I don't know, maybe putting more emphasis on that, just because things are so volatile and sensitive when it comes to what the public perspective sees it as? Or is that something that you don't think is really relevant to like really what you were working with these split-second decisions and some of the different things that go into that?
Yep, I think there's a lot of opportunity for expanding on some of that training. We do run into a logistical issue. We only have so many training hours that, I mean, you got competing interests when it comes to training and operations and you know, trying to fulfill all of these requirements. But there are some opportunities that we can look at from a training aspect that could probably help the officers out. I think the law enforcement people have a good understanding of who Gordon Graham is. He's kind of this national risk management type trainer that goes around the country, has webinars, and the chief actually, it comes to mind because the chief showed an hour-long video on risk management from Gordon Graham just at our last staff meeting. So there might be an opportunity there to use some of those web-based or video-based training sessions by an individual like Mr. Graham or any host of other legal scholars on use of force, and dovetail that also into our training rather than trying to explain it to our officers ourselves.
Thank you. Commissioner Heroux, thank you for those answers. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so just one point about objective reasonableness, and then if you'll indulge me, I had 2 questions for Deputy Chief Gonzalez. The Supreme Court has specifically said that they're not going to get boxed into providing, you know, sort of a rigid definition of what objective reasonableness is. And I saw it in the fine print on one of the slides, the option of last resort, right? Which is, you know, most agencies have a departmental policy specifically prohibiting striking somebody with your flashlight. And yet there will come potentially a certain time or moment where context dictates that if that is what is necessary to protect your life and the life of others, that despite the fact that it's a violation of policy, you would be expected to in fact engage in that, right? And so the Supreme Court actually took the time to say we can't make that sort of, we can't pigeonhole every decision for every officer, right? The job of an officer necessarily entails discretion and that includes uses of force, right? So one of the things that I always go back to when I'm discussing use of force in class is, and I think Commissioner Root mentioned it before, if we look at the Laquan McDonald shooting, right? Ultimately, the reason that Officer Jason Van Dyke got charged and convicted is because he clearly fails the objective reasonableness test. But the reason that we know that is because there were 7 other officers on scene and none of them fired their weapon, right? And so in hindsight, that's easy enough to say, well, it wasn't objectively reasonable for one officer to perceive this threat and the necessity of deadly force and 7 other officers at the scene to not see that threat and therefore not use deadly force. So, right, you know, like most other things that we look at in the legal profession, hindsight is 20/20 in that circumstance, right? So yeah, it's something that a lot of people grapple with. You know, it goes back to the Supreme Court being sort of intentionally vague about quite a bit when it comes to how the law gets applied, unfortunately. So 2 questions, if I could, for Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson. The first was, I was wondering how much the department is looking ahead in terms of some of the proposed legislation recently. So, for example, SB 992, I believe, is the one that requires a duty to intervene policy. So obviously you're ahead of the game in that. But there's also proposed legislation for a complete ban on chokeholds and windpipe blockages and things, essentially, I mean, seatbelt techniques, essentially any hold that might have that kind of impact. So I was just wondering if you've been sort of keeping up with proposed legislation to see how that might change your policies in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, if we're not doing it, we're doing ourselves a disservice. You know, to be honest with you, I personally track a lot of that legislation through MACP, the Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police. They have a legislative committee that tracks all of this. They put a nice little spreadsheet together, send it out to agencies. And they also include the organization, not the departments, but the organization's stance on any given bill. You know, the legislation, you talked about the legislation completely banning chokeholds. It'll be interesting to see how that rolls through the legislative branch, because like you said, you know, you go back to that last resort clause that MCOLS puts on their subject control continuum. We equate chokeholds or neck compression or carotid compression holds with deadly force. We do not allow that here at ELPD, even though under PPCT, pressure point control tactics, a carotid compression hold is allowed. But we say no, not here at ELPD, because too much can go wrong. So we equate that to deadly force. So we do watch that. I think, you know, sometimes obviously things get biased, of course. So we really do rely on MACP to give us some guidance on those things, where they're at.
Thank you. And then just my last question. I think some of the more recent concern about the use of force continuum is that it's not intended this way, but it has a tendency to lock officers into moving up and down the steps, right? So that the assumption is, if my suspect is doing this, I have to do this, when in some instances, de-escalation would suggest doing the opposite. And so some departments have moved to the critical decision-making model. I was wondering if you have encountered that, if you thought about looking into, it's based on something that came out of the English model. So obviously some significant differences in terms of what America looks like versus England. But we have an increasing number of agencies across the United States who have looked at that as, you know, allowing officers to be a little more dynamic and a little less rigid than use of force up and down the scale.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of knowledge base on that critical decision-making model. I've heard of it. The one thing that does come to mind when we talk about that model, though, is that this subject control continuum or use of force continuum, whatever you want to call it, has been drilled into police officers since day one. And so this is a big ship that, you know, is not going to turn on a dime. So there's a lot of, if we move to a different decision-making model, if we move to a different use of force model, there's a lot of training that has to come with that. Would have to be very intensive to make sure that we don't slip back into, well, we're going to do it this way because that's the way we always did it. So that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, I mean, just as a brief follow-up, part of that is sort of, I'm sure you've talked about, you know, the 21-foot rule and knife attacks and things like that, right? So it's designed to sort of move away from this rigid idea of, well, don't let them get within 21 feet to an idea of, you know, take advantage of distance, cover, and time, right? So that's the type of thing that it looks into.
Yep. Yeah, that 21-foot rule, that's a perfect example. I can remember being taught when I went through the police academy, if someone is, you know, within 18 feet of you and they have a knife, you should probably use deadly force, and that's probably not always the case these days.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe, for that great insight and questioning. And thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. Are there any other questions in regards to the presentation from the commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Root, please go ahead.
I have lots of questions, and I won't ask all of them. In regard to the reporting, I have, I'll bring up two questions. One is, would it be possible for you to give us the set of blank reports, you know, that are, you had that slide, I think it's number 9 of the different reports in the sequence of the individual officer and then the first line supervisor. And I don't even know if those are all written reports, but I think it would just help us to understand the reports better if we could see them, even if they're just blank. So I just wonder if that might be possible. Maybe we'd understand it better.
You're talking about the police report that's filed to document that use of force?
The use of force incident report that the officer files, and then the first line supervisor does something, and then there's the mini people icon. I don't remember what that one is. And then the more recent weekly report. If we could just, you know, I'm not asking for a report of a particular incident. I'm just saying if we could understand the reports better, that would even be helpful. Like you mentioned that you could extract from the individual incident report some demographic data. Well, that's interesting to know. And we could see that just on a blank report that it asks for that. So I think that just might be helpful information to just see blank reports.
Just to give you context of how that happens, though, that's not a fluid system. That's not a linear system of how we get to that. Again, I keep going back to these early warning systems.
Yeah.
That can generate a linear report like that because it gets routed to each step. These are, you know, notifications that are sent outside of that RMS reporting system. You know, so essentially what we're doing to document and put these reports together and track all this and review all this is we have kind of we've got a temporary system that works right now, but we can't continue it. We need a more formalized linear system that not just has the data component, but has the routing component as well. And all 3 of those systems have that to be able to route up the chain of command, if you will, for review all the way up to the chief. Just depends on how we set that up.
Well, I think you're going to get clearly support from the study committee to do that, to advance on that front. The other question I had, and maybe, well, the other question I had, you were just talking about in a way. The spreadsheet from the weekly arrest reports gives a bunch of incidents where use of force codes were entered. I'm wondering, can you give an example, or can you talk about percentage of time or something when somebody uses force and writes a report? Does it sometimes result in, a supervisor looking at it and saying, I wonder if this was appropriate? I'm not real sure about this. What the reports aren't just for the heck of writing. So, I'm wondering, in the system that you've been using, because that's the only one you've had, what is the experience about the use of that in kind of assessing what's going on, both at the individual officer level and in terms of policy of the department?
Yeah, absolutely. We have had instances. We've had, one specific incident that I can speak to, where the on-duty supervisor became aware of a use of force and said, I don't like this, routed it to admin, to police administration, and said, I have a problem with this. You guys should take a look at it. An inquiry was done, and so that's an example where the system worked, if you will. Our ad hoc system, our interim system worked because the supervisor at the supervisory level saw something they had concerns with, and notified it up the chain, and we did our inquiry as we should. So that is an example where our interim system here worked.
Thanks.
Thank you. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to tonight, just for the sake of time, if you just can wait and give us an opportunity to have a process where you submit your questions, and that'll give Deputy Chief Gonzalez and Chief Johnson, an opportunity to kind of really maximize their time a little bit better than going on this particular item. I hope that would be okay with you, unless you have something that you need to know and understand this moment. Okay. Yes, Commissioner Williams, go ahead.
I had a question for Mr. Hero, Dr. Hero. How would one operationalize or formalize that critical thinking model? And are there any cities that have integrated that into their oversight structure?
There are, I would have to go back and look to see which cities have implemented that in their training. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's a component of their oversight, but the training itself of the critical decision-making model sort of goes through a specific process in terms of collecting information, assessing the situation, sort of walking an officer through that decision-making process within a critical incident. Most of this comes out of PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum. So I can find those sources and send them out to the group.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll move on to item 4.3, public comment, which is limited to 5 minutes. Is the caller still on the line by chance, Justin?
Yes, I believe I still have Ed Rushton on the line, and I will allow to talk right now. And you can just unmute by dialing *6 to address the committee.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi. I first want to thank you all for allowing this public comment to happen. I was trying to get on the call earlier and I couldn't find a meeting ID on the agenda page. I had to end up going to the notice of electronic meetings pages. So if anything, I just start with, I think most people usually go through the agenda page to find the meeting ID, like with the city council meetings. So if going forward, we could add one of those to the agenda pages, I would appreciate that. And I think a few other people might as well. Really, I just wanted to ask about section 12.2. I'll try to keep this as fast as possible. That talks about administrative sanctions for, it should be constructed as a creation of higher legal standard of safety or care in an evidentiary sense with respect to civil suits or administrative claims. violations of this policy may form the basis for departmental administrative sanctions, but there is no listing of what the sanctions are. I was curious if we could get some more information on that.
Did you want to respond to that, Deputy Chief, by chance?
Yeah, administrative sanctions, quite simply put, discipline, employee discipline. So everything from a reprimand all the way up to termination. So violations of the policy, they form the basis for departmental discipline or administrative sanctions from an employment standard or standpoint.
Thank you. For the caller, is that all you had in regards to your call?
Yes, I think maybe this would be something saved better for the December 7th meeting, but just to, if we could get more clarity on exactly what kinds of violations, just exactly what kinds of discipline, say a use of force violation or misreporting a use of force, punching in the wrong code, what kinds of sanctions would be meeting those sorts of violations. So that's just something I'd like to encourage you all to think about going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Rushton, and I appreciate the call and your input. That is a good inquiry, just to kind of understand that a little bit better, what administrative sanctions consist of, or a policy, or a process, or comparatively to what happens when something happens. So I'd be interested also to see more about that. I appreciate your call tonight. Is that all we have for calls tonight, Justin?
Yes, it is.
All right. We'll be moving on to item 5, subcommittee point. Excuse me, it's been a long night. Subcommittee reports 5.1, and we have Group 1 research oversight commissions in non-comparable cities. Please go ahead. If you'd like to discuss or react to the information in regards to item 5.1. Study Committee Group 1, DOJ action under 1994 crime control. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta, we're good on that for now? No discussion? All right, item 5.2, Group 2, Study Committee report to Council. Subgroup memo draft report outline. Yes, Commissioner Garcia Jr.
I think Mr. Williams was trying to address 5.1, but he didn't come through.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss you, Commissioner Williams, on 5.1?
I was going to say that, we busied ourselves writing the components of what has been introduced. And we kind of exchanged emails, but we haven't really sat down and discussed or read, at least in my case, I haven't read what the other people did. So it's what you have here is each of our 3 homework assignments, and we have yet to put our heads together and kind of get an idea of where to go.
Yes, Commissioner Josephson, and then Commissioner Harrell, please.
I just want to second that. And I also included a lot of links in some of them, and I know it's in a PDF form, so I can submit the actual documents as well, because I think it's worth looking into the attachments that are on each of those websites, because I talk about all the different reports of each jurisdiction and department. And I think they also talk about the amendments that they've made to their profiles since, and some of the bullet points that I have on those come from the amendments and some come from the original. But I think it's relevant to the group to look into maybe our documents before our next meeting, so we're not spending 45 minutes talking about just our component, because it is a lot of information and it'll take a while.
Appreciate that, Commissioner Josephson. Commissioner Harrell.
I think it might be useful if we could sort of append some of this information to the sheet that City Manager Lahanas had with the PA 312 and the Big Ten cities, where if we could get some sort of foundational spreadsheet of, city, population, department size, essentially those columns that were already in that spreadsheet, if we could add the information that our subcommittee had found and any others that come in, that way we could have sort of one complete document to work off of these various comparables and non-comparables. I think that would be very helpful to a lot of people.
City Manager Lahanas, is that something that is okay with you?
Sorry, I was muted. You can just make another cities chart and use the same tables and we can add it to one PDF, or you can add them to that. However you want to do it, it's fine with me. It's a document that's for you guys to have as a reference. So whatever you want to do with it. It might be nice to have 3 separate ones, 312 comparables, Big 10, and then other cities that are relevant that you want us to look at and go through. Then you could have 3 different charts, but with the same layout. I think that layout is nice for sort of judging them, but you can give this stuff to us and we can make one PDF of it, however you want to do it. It's fine with us. We can help out.
So my understanding is, Commissioner Herrera, you're going to work with City Manager Lahanas and get that.
Yeah, I can spend a little bit of time sort of pulling out the relevant information from what Helen and Eric have done, and then try to put together a spreadsheet to then send on to everybody else.
Yes, thank you for doing that. And you probably know this, but make sure we go through Mrs. Schaefer and all that stuff. Good stuff with that. Any other comments in regards to item 5.1? Reactions? All right, I think I'll go back to 5.2, the study group report, and we talked a little bit about that. Do you guys want to go into that more? Or I think we have a decision made on that, and I think we're good, unless I'm mistaken on that. Okay.
I think the only question
yes.
would be for
who's talking? Commissioner
Caldwell. Is just timeline for Commissioner Tyler to work with, and I guess what would be feasible there. So would the turnaround be like the December 7th meeting or the December 14th meeting? And does that feel like adequate enough time to draft that first section? And then, yeah.
Commissioner Tyler, how do you feel about your turnaround time and your schedule with that and everything?
I'm leaning toward December 14th.
And then I think maybe based off that, we can at that meeting have some just discussion and review of that and then go forward from there. But I think just having some clarity around when that first piece would be due is good.
Yes, I was going to bring it up in my commissioner announcements because I forgot you had brain that, so you got me. So good job on that. So we're good for that. All right, so I think we can move on to item 0.6, commissioner concerns. Does anyone have any concerns? I know we discussed quite a bit of things tonight. Is there anything that we didn't capture that is important to you? Commissioner Garcia.
So I have 2 items. I'll make them quick. First of all, December 7th and 14th, we have meetings. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and we briefly discussed whether we're going to hear input from the community at the December 7th meeting, and then I wasn't clear on, we just ended that. Are we now no longer seeking community input?
That's correct. I think what we're going to be doing and talking about is first the community survey.
No, I'm fine with that. My only concern with that is, have we reached out to these groups yet to ask for them to present to us? Have we reached out to Black Lives Matter yet, or we've not done that? Has it just been an idea?
No, we haven't.
Okay, then I'm fine with that then, as long as we haven't done that. The other comment.
Yeah. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
The other comment I want to mention is I think we can glean some information from Deputy Chief Gonzalez replying to Chris Root's question about the process they have currently with use of force review. And when Deputy Chief Gonzalez mentioned that sergeant, who should be commended, that found issue with that use of force incident in your system that you have now. Not sure what shift that sergeant was from, but I can recall being on the midnight shift and having reviewed many, many reports. And sometimes you just miss those things. You miss those things because you've got so much work on your docket. Or in the worst case scenario, and I'm not saying that would ever happen here in East Lansing, is you're taking care of one of your buddies when you see something that's not just sitting right for you. That's the importance of an early warning system. You cannot cover that kind of stuff up. So I hope you commended that. I'm sure you did that, Sergeant, for bringing that to the attention of administration. But without something more precise than an early warning system, it's really, you're setting yourself up for a whole lot of bad press and bad publicity, and then community pushback. So that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia, and I second that, especially that second part of what you said there. Any other things from any other commissioners? All right, we don't have anything for old business on an item. Did someone raise their hand?
Yeah, Commissioner Colwood, just a reminder that I won't be there on the 7th.
We'll miss you. All right, there's nothing under old business unless someone, and we are at item number 8 for adjournment. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner Williams. Is there a second?
Support.
Supported by Commissioner Root. I don't think there's any discussion on adjourning at this time. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, staff. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, everyone that has stood by us tonight. This was a very productive meeting. Appreciate you. We got some great momentum and doing a lot of different things together as a whole group. So I appreciate you. Good night.
Happy Thanksgiving all. Good night. Thank you.
You as well.